So the next question is, how do we build middle paragraphs of a college level essay answering the question about how to texts are foundational texts? And to do that, I'm going to suggest that we use a technique that I call IIET. Four little things, IIET, four letters that help us build substantial, analytical, and argumentative paragraphs. And of course, this has to do with quotations. For each of the texts that you choose, you're going to need to come up with three quotations that really help you make the point. If this text is foundational, here are three quotations that demonstrate that give you a glimpse of what the text says and why its information is so very essential as to help that text be defined as a foundational text. So you guys know how to do this. You know how to read a text and look for juicy quotes. I call them hot spots, quotations that leap out at us as being worthy of more reflection, more analysis. They need to sit longer in our heads, or we think they are really right or good or true or well expressed. There's all kinds of ways a hot spot might be determined, but there are those quotes, those juicy, meaning-filled quotes that we're looking for in our reads. Sometimes it takes one or two or three passes with a text to really find them, and very often we find lots of them. 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 in a reading of a text. But that's what your research reading is looking for. It's looking for juicy quotes. And once you've got 5, 6, or 7, because you love this text and there's so many juicy quotes that explain what it's doing so well, your next step is to limit that down to 3. Okay, of all the juicy quotes I've found, what 3 are going to be really useful to me? What 3 really connect with this idea I've defined of a foundation, of a fundamental, of an elemental primary text that really serves people and communities across the many different dimensions of their lives. Which of these 3 quotes are really going to serve me? Okay, now I've limited it down to 3, and this is going to be really the stuff of the middle part of your essay. So here's an example of one that I like very much. The unexamined life is not worth living. You may recognize this. You may have come across it. You may have tattooed it onto your left forearm. But it's one of the most famous phrases out of Plato's The Apology of Socrates, that last text that we looked at. It shows up on line 38, 5 through 6, or section 38, 5 through 6. Your first job is to accurately transcribe and identify the text. So we open it with quotations, we close it with quotations, then we add the MLA, parenthetical in-text citation, a fancy word for the author and the lines. With old texts, we always define the lines as opposed to the page numbers, because there's so many translations, we want people to be able to find the text in any version. So that's what a quotation, a hotspot, looks like when we've included it. And so of these 4 things, IIET, it stands for introduce the text, include the text, explain the quotation, and then tie my explanation to the main purpose and focus of my paper. Introduce, include, explain, and tie. 4 things that we have to do with a quotation. Well, all right, we've just showed it. So if I'm going to include it, I'm going to write quotations. The unexamined life is not worth living. End quote. Open parentheses, the author, the section or the chapter, and the lines. And notice I open parentheses and I end the period for the whole sentence after that parenthesis. That's where it goes. You can see, if it's really long, you might use a block quotation, and you can see how to do that in the MLA sample paper if you don't know already. So that's what it looks like to properly include a quotation in MLA. So now I need another sentence. I need some kind of sentence to introduce the quotation, to ready the readers. I might say, in the famous, in the celebrated 4th century dialogue called The Defense of Socrates, if that's the title you're using. The Defense of Socrates. One of Socrates' students quotes him as saying, the unexpected life is not worth living. So I might use one sentence to introduce. I might use two sentences. If it's the very first quotation, I might have a few more lines of introduction before the first quote. If it's my second or third quotation, I might say, later in Plato's defense, or later in Plato's writing of the defense of Socrates, or later Socrates, this character in the defense says. So you want to be precise. Are you talking about Socrates, the speaker? Are you talking about Plato, the writer? But you want a few sentences to introduce, to get the reader ready. Let us know that there is a quotation coming up. All right, so now I've introduced and I've included. Now I have to explain it. And to explain a quotation, we know a couple things. We have maybe keywords. The unexamined life, that's a keyword, is not worth living, says Socrates. So I might write some sentences that talk about this. Socrates is talking about self-reflection. He is a proponent of examining, of questioning, of wondering about what we're doing, whether it's aligned with our purpose, whether it's aligned with our skills. He wants us to examine, to reflect, to measure, to consider, to take inventory of our lives, to ask ourselves, are our lives being put to the best use? Are our lives, because that notion of value, worth, really has a question of value. How are you going to live? How am I going to live a life that has value, or that squeezes the most value out of the few years and the limited time I have? And for Socrates, the way we do that is some critical self-reflection. It's really important to go inside and ask ourselves hard, difficult, critical questions. That, for Socrates, is one of the most important first principles. In fact, because Socrates talks about the quality of life, okay, now I've already started going in. After you've explained it, your next job is to tie it. Tie it to the issue of the paper, which is foundational. Well, because Plato talks about living a good life, which is something that everybody wants to do, that everybody should measure their actions again, it is a text about first principles. It's about a way of being. It's a text that connects with rules for living that would hold true no matter what we did, no matter the constitution of our family or our career or our geography. Still, as people, we still want to think of, are we doing the things that we are, that are consistent with our intention, with our best selves, with the value, with being good shepherds, good husbands of the value that we have, of our capacity and our skill? Are we? All these questions are primary. They have to do with something that happens before any of the other decisions that we make. In order to think about all the little stuff of life, I need to have this first stuff in order, according to Socrates. So those are 3 or 4 sentences, and I'm just riffing now, but those are 3 or 4 sentences that are trying to take the ideas of the quotation and tie them to the purpose and the focus of the paper. To explain a quotation, look at the key words and talk about the key words in your own words. But to tie a quotation, remind the reader of that word, foundational. You can repeat that word, foundation, foundational, in those tying in sentences to help the reader realize that we're not just talking about this quote to talk about this quote. We're talking about this quote as a piece of evidence for the argument that this paper is making. I just said it. I just said that horrible 2 words, evidence and argument, because that's kind of what we're doing. The idea of this paper is to define foundational text, and I am in fact arguing that this text, my chosen text, is an example by showing you quotes, showing you evidence that both I and you, the reader, can assess as a legitimate way of understanding. So what do I have after I've built this iiet? I've introduced the text in 1, 2, or 3 sentences. I've included the text, the citation, the quote, which may be 1, 2, or 3 sentences long. I've explained the quotation in my own words, looking carefully at the key words and why they're important, 1, 2, 3, or 4 sentences. And then last but not least, I've used 2, 3, 4 sentences to tie the ideas of the quotation to the focus of my paper. What does that make? 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Well, what that makes is one heck of a generous paragraph. And more importantly, it's a generous paragraph of careful textual analysis and using that analysis to make an argument in a paper that I've made. It includes a text. It analyzes that text by talking about the words and the words' ideas in current language, in my own language of the paper. And then it takes that examination and highlights it as evidence by tying it in to the idea of the paper, which in this case is about foundations and foundational text. iiet. Now, that's how we build a middle of a paper. It looks, some of you may have noticed, a lot like a scholar's notebook entry that we may have done. I tricked you into giving you practice without even telling you. But it's a dependable, repeatable, measurable task that we can do to build strong, textually based evidence in an argumentative paper of literary or textual analysis. So 1, 2, 3. All of a sudden, I have 3 paragraphs, generous, substantial, grounded, delicious paragraphs of textual analysis for my first text. Then I can do a great big pivot. You know, I'm going to pivot to the Gospel of Mark, or I'm going to pivot to Aesop's Fable, or I'm going to pivot to the Analects, or maybe it's the Sutra that's my big pivot. I might have a few more sentences to say, you know, here's one text from Greece, and here's a text from another whole part of the world. Interestingly, it's a student text about teachers writing as well, but it's from a whole different worldview. Let's go look at the Analects and look at how the Analects might serve as a foundational text. Boom, boom, boom. When the wind blows, the grasses bend. There's all kinds of great Analects if that's a text that you like. So again, 3 quotes from the Analects, iiet, 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 and now we have beautiful 2 big, substantial middle halves of a middle of our paper. We've got a beautiful, rich paragraph about what a foundational text is. We have 1 example backed up with evidence. We have a second example backed up from evidence. So now there's all that's left to do is write an ending for this midterm take-home essay exam. And come back to me in just a few seconds and we'll talk about endings. Or better yet, go write the middle of your paper without thinking at all about, go write. You can write one of these in 20 minutes or maybe 30 minutes. You could write 3 of them back to back. You could write one at different parts of the day, and because now you know what your writing task is. It's just a quote, an IIET quote. It's measurable, it's minimal. You can crank one of these out in 20 or 30 minutes of focused writing time, and then take a break and know that you can come back to the next quotation another time. Or perhaps you can do all three and give yourself a well-earned break. But notice, by breaking this essay apart into manageable chunks, it's so less daunting and scary to do. We have already written the beginning. We can sit and work on these 6 paragraphs that will be the middle all at once or in different writing bits. I think it's best to spread them out over time. Do 1 or 2 and then come back and do the third. Pick up the next a second day. Reread the text, find the quotes, do 2 or 3. It's much, much better to give yourself some space. Give yourself an hour to one night. Give yourself an hour or 2 the next afternoon, and you'll be building up this paper in a much more dependable and measurable way. Keep track of what you've planned to do in your writing session and how long it takes. Be mindful of your focus, your energy state before you get and write. Because that's suddenly, oh, it's so hard. I never get started on papers. I'm such a procrastinator. Well, guess what? We're not when we have a plan. And when the plan is reasonable, no one wants to sit down. No one's going to sit down and crank out a 7-page paper, except maybe Brianna. Most of us, it's hard work to do this. But boy, does it help to have a plan, to have a time plan, to have a schedule for the project, and to have little bits that you can work on, and then give yourself huge celebrations. I've got my 3 quotes done for my first text. Yay! Have some tea, do a hooray dance, go for a walk with your dog, play with your child, look at your spouse who you haven't seen for weeks on end. Any of those are appropriate little celebrations, because you should be celebrating after doing each of these difficult tasks. The little parts can be just as worthy of your acknowledgement as the big giant piece that's coming at the end. All right, back in a few minutes, we'll talk about the end of the paper as well.